Nordstrom never made a single dollar of profit in Canada. Not in year one, not in year 9. Every single year the doors were open, the company lost money, and it kept them open anyway. In September 2014, crowds lined up outside Calgary's Chinook Centre before sunrise. Shoppers pressed against the glass, waiting for a name they had read about for years. The retailer famous for treating every customer like royalty, for taking back a set of tires it never even sold. 9 years later, those same doors were covered in liquidation signs. 60, 70, 80% off. Empty racks. Security guards where sales associates used to be. 13 stores, gone in a single spring. How does a company with over a century of trust behind it walk into a new country with every advantage and still lose money for 9 straight years on purpose before finally giving up? The answer says less about Nordstrom than it does about the country it tried and failed to understand. Johann Wilhelm Nordstrom was born on February 15, 1871 in the village of Alvik, 60 miles from the Arctic Circle in northern Sweden. His father was a blacksmith and part-time farmer who died when the boy was 8. 3 years later, his mother pulled him out of school to work the family farm. There was no dream of department stores in that childhood. There was only work, cold, and the flat certainty that nothing in Alvik was going to change. At 16, he left. In 1887, with $5 in his pocket and no English, he boarded a ship for New York, then worked his way west, logging camps, railway crews, mine shafts, until he landed in Seattle, a rough Pacific timber town still cutting its way out of the forest. It was there, reading a newspaper account of gold in the Klondike, that he decided to gamble everything one more time. He spent 2 years in the Alaskan goldfields. When a rival miner challenged his claim, rather than fight it out in a corrupt arbitration process, he simply sold his stake and walked away. $13,000 richer and done with mining for good. He returned to Seattle, anglicized his name to John, and married a fellow Swedish immigrant, Hilda Carlson, in 1900. He had money now, and no idea what to do with it, until he ran into a shoe repairman he'd known from his Klondike days, Carl Wallen. Wallen had a small cobbler's shop and a suggestion. Why not open a proper shoe store together? Nordstrom put in $5,000. Wallen put in $1,000. Neither man spoke fluent English. Neither one looked like a fashion man. What they had instead was a shared belief, plain and unglamorous. Give people the best selection, the best quality, and the best service, and the rest would take care of itself. On a spring morning in 1901, the doors of Wallen and Nordstrom opened at 4th Avenue and Pike Street in downtown Seattle. It was a narrow storefront, barely 20 feet wide, with shelves of shoes stacked floor to ceiling and the sharp smell of new leather hanging in the air. There was no grand opening, no advertisement in the paper. A customer walked in, sat down, and a Swedish immigrant who could barely explain the sizing in English knelt down to fit their foot personally. The way he'd learned it had to be done, properly, patiently, one customer at a time. The first day's till came to $12.50. It was not much, but it was honest, and it was theirs. Nordstrom carried more stock per square foot than almost any competitor in the city. The story goes that Seattle's Scandinavian community simply had bigger feet than most, and the store adjusted its inventory accordingly. Whatever the reason, the habit stuck. Never make a customer settle for what's on the shelf. Find the size. Find the fit. Earn the sale by making the customer feel like the only one in the room. That single stubborn idea, service before scale, the customer before the ledger, would carry a 20-foot shoe store through 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and 4 generations of a Swedish immigrant family until it became one of the most trusted names in American retail. It would also, more than a century later, be the very idea that Canada would test, and the test that Nordstrom would fail. By the late 1970s, the little Seattle shoe store had become something else entirely, and it had a sound all its own. Walk into a Nordstrom on any given afternoon during these years, and before a customer even reached the escalators, they would hear it. A grand piano, live, somewhere near the main floor, playing softly through the racks of clothing. No other department store in America did this. It wasn't background music piped through speakers. It was a real musician at a real piano, filling the store with something that felt less like shopping and more like an occasion. That detail mattered because Nordstrom had built its entire golden era on a single radical idea. Retail didn't have to feel transactional. It could feel personal. It could feel like someone actually cared whether a customer walked out happy. The proof of that idea became the most famous customer service story in American retail. In the late 1970s, at a Nordstrom store in Fairbanks, Alaska, a local customer walked in carrying two used snow tires. He insisted he'd bought them in that very building. And technically, he wasn't wrong. Nordstrom had purchased the property from Northern Commercial Company, a retailer that really did sell tires, just a few years earlier. A young sales associate named Craig Trounce could have turned the man away. Nordstrom didn't sell tires. It never had. Instead, Trounce called a local tire dealer to work out a fair price, opened the till, and handed the man his money back. It should have ended there. An odd afternoon, quickly forgotten. Instead, the story spread. Trade magazines picked it up. Business schools started teaching it. Decades later, people who had never set foot in Alaska were still repeating it as proof of what Nordstrom stood for. The company hung actual tires in break rooms as a reminder to new hires. The lesson underneath it was simple, and it was written into the employee handbook in exactly one sentence. Use good judgment in all situations. That was the entire rule book. Everything else was left to the person standing in front of the customer. That kind of trust changed how employees carried themselves on the sales floor. Commission-based pay meant a good shoe salesman could make a real living, a career, not just a job, if customers kept coming back to him specifically. So employees remembered names. They remembered shoe sizes, favorite colors, upcoming anniversaries. They called customers at home when a new shipment came in that matched what someone had been looking for. They personally delivered a suit to a customer's office the morning of a job interview because the alterations hadn't been finished in time. None of this was corporate policy handed down from Seattle. It was individual employees deciding, one interaction at a time, what good judgment looked like. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, that culture carried Nordstrom out of the Pacific Northwest for the first time in its history. In May 1978, the company opened its first California store at South Coast Plaza in Orange County. A genuine gamble, since almost nobody outside Washington and Oregon had ever heard the name. It worked. California shoppers responded to the same things Seattle shoppers had responded to for decades. A sales floor that didn't feel like a factory, where a person, not a policy, decided how you'd be treated. 10 years later, in 1988, Nordstrom crossed the entire continent, opening its first East Coast location outside Washington, D.C. By then, the piano, the shoe fittings, the handwritten thank you notes, the whole ritual had become something shoppers actively sought out, city after city, as the chain expanded. For the customers who grew up during these decades, Nordstrom wasn't just a place to buy clothes. It became attached to the milestones of an entire adult life. A teenager's first pair of proper dress shoes for a school dance. A young graduate's first interview suit, tailored on the spot, free of charge, because that was simply how it was done. A bride's wedding registry, handled by the same sales associate from the first appointment to the final gift returned after the reception. Parents brought their children in for the ritual of the annual back-to-school shoes fitting, where a trained associate would measure both feet, because Nordstrom's fitters knew, long before anyone talked about it publicly, that most people's feet aren't quite the same size. It was a small detail. It was also exactly the kind of small detail that made customers feel like the store actually knew what it was doing and actually cared. The culture reached far enough into American life that it started showing up in the culture itself. Sitcoms and magazine writers used the Nordstrom way as shorthand for service done right, the gold standard against which every other retailer's customer service was measured and almost always found wanting. Business schools built entire case studies around the tire story and the one-line employee handbook. By the early 1990s, when the fourth generation of the Nordstrom family took over as co-presidents, the company wasn't just a regional favorite anymore. It was, by reputation, one of the most trusted retail names in the entire country. Employees who worked the floor during these years often describe it the same way, a kind of quiet pride in being trusted to make the right call without asking permission first. There was no script to read from. There was no manager hovering to approve a return or a discount. There was only the expectation that you would treat the person in front of you the way you'd want to be treated yourself, and the company would back you up if you did. That trust extended all the way down to a single associate behind a counter in Fairbanks, Alaska, was the entire engine behind everything Nordstrom would go on to build. It was also, though nobody could have known it yet, a formula built entirely around one country, one culture, one set of assumptions about what customers wanted and what they were willing to pay for it. Nobody was thinking about Canada yet. In a few more decades, they would be, and the question of whether that same formula could survive a border crossing would turn out to matter more than anyone in Seattle ever imagined. By 2012, Nordstrom was no longer the modest Pacific Northwest name it had been a generation earlier. The company operated 234 stores across 31 states, including 117 full-line department stores and 113 Nordstrom racks. It had crossed the Rockies in 1978, crossed the Mississippi by the early 1990s, and reached the East Coast in 1988. Every one of those stores was corporate-owned. There was no franchise model, no local owner buying in with their own capital and their own risk. Every location answered directly to Seattle, which meant every location was expected to deliver the exact same experience. The same shoe-fitting ritual, the same empowered sales staff, the same unwritten promise that a customer's problem was the store's problem to solve. Replicating that culture store by store, city by city, had always been the hardest part of growing Nordstrom. It required hiring the right people and trusting them completely. It was slow, deliberate work, and for 80 years it had never failed. Then on September 13, 2012, the company announced it was taking that formula somewhere it had never gone before, across an international border. The deal was built around a single relationship. Nordstrom partnered with Cadillac Fairview, the real estate arm of the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan and one of the largest commercial landlords in the country, controlling nearly 47 million square feet of leasable space across Canada's most prominent shopping centers. The plan called for 4 full-line stores in the first wave: Calgary's Chinook Centre, Ottawa's Rideau Centre, and locations in Toronto and Vancouver, with as many as 9 full-line stores envisioned over the long term, plus a growing roster of off-price Nordstrom Rack locations to follow. Eric Nordstrom, then president of stores, called it a chance to better serve our Canadian customers closer to home, acknowledging in the same breath that the company was new to the country and would have to earn its way in. There was a detail buried in that announcement that would only look significant in hindsight. Most of the new Canadian stores, including the flagship in Calgary, were being built into real estate recently vacated by Sears Canada, a department store chain that was, at that very moment, in the process of shrinking toward its own collapse. Nordstrom was walking into department store-shaped holes left behind by a company already losing the fight. Nobody in Seattle framed it that way in 2012. It was simply available, prestigious mall space, offered up by a partner eager to fill it. Calgary was chosen to go first, and the choice made sense on paper. Alberta was riding an oil boom. Household incomes in the city were among the highest in the country, and Chinook Centre, at more than 1.3 million square feet, anchored by Hudson's Bay and soon to add Saks Fifth Avenue, was already the busiest, highest-grossing mall in the province. On September 19, 2014, Nordstrom opened its first Canadian doors there. A 140,000-square-foot store with 5 separate shoe departments, a full cosmetics floor, and the same brand roster, Burberry, Missoni, Vince Camuto, that shoppers in Seattle or Chicago would have recognized instantly. Store manager Sheila Wooldridge told the local press the team was ready to work hard to take care of customers here in Calgary and earn the kind of loyalty the brand had spent a century building south of the border. For the employees hired into that first Canadian store, the expansion meant something concrete, a brand new career opportunity built around a service culture with a genuine reputation, arriving in cities that had never had it before. Sales associates went through the same training used in every American store. The same emphasis on judgment over policy, the same expectation that a customer's problem was worth solving personally. For a generation of Canadian retail workers, it was, for a little while, exciting to be part of something with that kind of pedigree. But growth on this scale carried a quieter pressure that hadn't existed when Nordstrom expanded one American state at a time. Every previous expansion, California in 1978, Virginia in 1988, Illinois in 1991, had moved into a market that shared the same currency, the same supply chains, the same consumer habits the company already understood. Canada did not. Different tax structure, different shipping and customs realities, a population roughly one-tenth the size of the United States, spread across a landmass nearly as large, concentrated into a handful of major cities, separated by enormous distances. The playbook that had worked in city after American city was about to be run, largely unchanged, in a country that didn't quite fit the same shape. Nobody inside Nordstrom was worried about that yet. The Calgary opening drew crowds. Plans were already moving forward for Ottawa, Toronto, and Vancouver, with more cities under consideration after that. The expansion machine that had carried Nordstrom from one small shoe store to a continental department store chain was doing exactly what it had always done, moving into new territory with confidence, certain that good judgment and good service would translate anywhere. The next few years would test that certainty more than anyone in Seattle expected. By 2019, Nordstrom had reached the peak of its physical footprint, 390 stores spread across 40 American states, plus Canada and Puerto Rico, the widest the company would ever be. It was no longer a regional favorite with a good reputation. It had become something closer to a national institution, the retailer other retailers were measured against. The name business schools used as shorthand for doing it right. Nothing captured that status better than a sale. Since the early 1960s, Nordstrom had run something almost no other department store bothered with: a summer sale built entirely around brand new merchandise, not last season's leftovers. It began modestly at the Seattle flagship, as a way to bring shoppers through the doors during the slow summer months. It worked immediately, and it never stopped working. By the 2010s, the anniversary sale had become one of the most anticipated retail events in the country. A full month of markdowns on next season's arrivals, with early access reserved for loyal cardholders, and a waiting list of shoppers building wish lists weeks in advance. Long before Black Friday became a cultural punchline, and long before anyone had heard of Prime Day, Nordstrom had already invented the modern preseason sale, and American shoppers had already built an annual ritual around it. That ritual carried real weight in people's lives. Mothers took daughters to the anniversary sale the way other families treated a holiday. Regular customers built relationships with a single sales associate over years, sometimes decades, the same person fitting their children's first school shoes who, years later, was helping style that same child for a first job interview. It wasn't advertising copy. It was simply how a certain kind of shopping worked at Nordstrom, generation after generation, in city after city, for the better part of 60 years. Employees who worked the floor during these peak years describe a particular kind of pride that came with wearing a Nordstrom name tag. The training was real. The autonomy was real. A sales associate wasn't reading from a script or waiting for a manager's approval to make a customer happy. They were trusted, from day one, to use their own judgment, the same way Craig Trounce had been trusted with 2 Alaskan snow tires decades earlier. Commission structures meant a talented associate could build an actual career on the sales floor, not just pass through it on the way to somewhere else. For many employees, Nordstrom wasn't a retail job, it was a craft. Geographically, the brand had become something rare, a genuinely unifying national experience. A shopper in suburban Chicago, and a shopper in downtown Seattle, and now a shopper in Calgary or Ottawa or Vancouver could walk into a Nordstrom and find the same live piano near the escalators, the same 5 shoe departments, the same associates trained to remember names and sizes and birthdays. The Canadian stores opened between 2014 and 2018 were part of that same physical high-water mark. 6 full-line stores and 7 rack locations, folded into the 390 store count that represented the company at its absolute largest. Chinook Center in Calgary, Rideau Center in Ottawa, the Eaton Center in Toronto, Pacific Center in Vancouver. These weren't afterthoughts. They were anchor tenants in some of the most prominent shopping centers in the country, exactly the kind of prestigious real estate a brand at its peak was supposed to occupy. From the outside in 2019, everything about Nordstrom looked like a company still climbing. Revenue topped $15 billion that year. The anniversary sale drew crowds across 2 countries. Fourth-generation family leadership sat atop a chain that had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the rise of the shopping mall, and the first wave of e-commerce panic that had already killed off weaker department store chains around it. But peaks are deceptive things. They look the same from every angle except the one that matters. What's happening just beneath the surface, in the numbers nobody outside the boardroom was seeing yet. In Canada specifically, behind the ribbon cuttings and the crowded opening days, a quieter story had been unfolding since the very first year. Every single one of those 13 Canadian stores, including the flagship that had opened with such fanfare in Calgary back in 2014, had lost money. Not most years, not the difficult years, every year without exception since the day the doors opened. The company had absorbed those losses quietly, the way a much larger, much healthier business can absorb a struggling division for years without anyone outside finance ever noticing. The anniversary sales still drew crowds in Calgary that summer. The piano still played near the escalators in Toronto. Nothing on the sales floor gave any hint that anything was wrong. Underneath it, the first cracks had already been spreading for the better part of 5 years. The strange thing about Nordstrom's first year in Canada was that nothing about it looked like a failure. The Chinook Center store in Calgary drew genuine crowds through the fall of 2014. Sales associates were busy. Local press covered the opening as a genuine coup for the city. And yet, tucked away in the company's internal ledgers, a pattern was already forming that nobody outside the finance department had any reason to notice. The Canadian business had lost money in year 1. It would go on to lose money in every single year that followed, without exception, for the entire 9 years the chain operated north of the border. That fact alone should have been the loudest possible warning sign. A store that loses money in its first year isn't unusual. Most retail expansions take time to find their footing. A store that is still losing money in its 5th, 6th, and 7th years, while its parent company keeps opening new locations anyway, is something else entirely. The reasons weren't a single dramatic failure. They were a dozen smaller ones, compounding quietly, year after year. Canada's population was a fraction of the size of the American market Nordstrom already understood. Roughly 1/10 as many people, spread across a landmass nearly as large, clustered into a handful of major cities, separated by enormous distances. That geography made everything more expensive. Shipping inventory across the border, maintaining a supply chain built for American distribution centers, stocking stores in cities that simply didn't have the same density of high-income shoppers Nordstrom had relied on for a century in the United States. The company had assumed Canadian consumers, particularly in wealthy pockets of Calgary, Toronto, and Vancouver, would behave like their American counterparts and reach for the same premium brands at the same volume. That assumption never fully held. Nordstrom had also, by most retail analysts' accounts, moved into some of the most expensive real estate available: premier malls, anchor positions, prime square footage, the kind of leases that only make sense if sales match the ambition of the address. And the market itself was shifting under everyone's feet at the same time. Online shopping was eating into physical department store traffic across North America. But it hit newer, less established chains hardest. Chains that hadn't had 60 years to build the kind of loyal, in-person customer relationships Nordstrom enjoyed in Seattle or Chicago. In Canada, Nordstrom had no such history to fall back on. It was competing for attention against Hudson's Bay, Holt Renfrew, and Simons, chains with decades, in some cases a century or more, of established Canadian relationships. While trying to build brand loyalty from a standing start, all while the entire department store format was already under pressure everywhere. Retail consultant Doug Stevens, watching the pattern unfold from the outside, later described the broader environment plainly. The department store channel was being squeezed from both directions at once. Discount retailers pulling price-sensitive shoppers away on one side, true luxury boutiques pulling high-end shoppers away on the other, with e-commerce chipping away at both flanks simultaneously. Nordstrom wasn't failing because it did something uniquely wrong. It was failing because it had entered a shrinking category in an unfamiliar country at close to the worst possible moment to be doing either. Inside individual stores, employees noticed the strain long before head office in Seattle said anything publicly. Retail analysts who reviewed internal sales figures from 2019, a full 5 years after the Calgary opening, and still a year before COVID-19 would make everything worse, found early signs the Canadian business was struggling to hit its numbers. For a floor associate in Toronto or Ottawa, the pattern would have shown up in smaller, more human ways. Quieter afternoons than head office projections assumed. Promotional markdowns arriving more often than they should have. Corporate visits from American executives asking pointed questions about performance that never fully got answered in public. And still the company kept building. Nordstrom didn't retreat from Canada after the early warning signs. It kept expanding. The first Nordstrom Rack location didn't even open in the country until 2018, 4 years after the first full-line store, and the off-price chain continued adding Canadian locations right through 2020, with a store opening in Langley, British Columbia, just months before the pandemic hit. A company that was already losing money every single year in a country it had entered continued signing new leases, continued hiring new staff, continued betting that scale would eventually solve a problem that scale hadn't touched in half a decade. Why did it take so long to reckon with the pattern? Part of the answer is the same one behind almost every slow corporate failure. From the parent company's perspective, Canada represented only a few percentage points of total company sales, a manageable drag rather than an emergency. It was easy to keep believing next year would be the year the Canadian business finally turned a corner, because the losses, while consistent, weren't yet large enough to force an answer. That belief would carry Nordstrom through the better part of a decade. It would not survive contact with a global pandemic and the inflation that followed it. The two forces that would finally turn a slow, quiet, forgivable pattern of losses into something the company could no longer explain away. By the time anyone outside the company said the word crisis out loud, the pattern had already been running for the better part of a decade. Nordstrom's Canadian business had lost money every single year since 2014. Not once had it broken even. And yet, through 2018, through 2019, through the early months of 2020, the company kept building. New rack stores, continued investment, continued belief that scale would eventually solve what 9 years of losses hadn't. Understanding why requires looking honestly at the decisions made, and just as honestly at the ones that were never made at all. The first decision, made back in 2012, was to carry the American formula across the border largely unchanged. Nordstrom entered Canada with the same store format, the same brand assortment, the same real estate strategy that had worked for decades south of the border. Premium anchor space in the country's most prestigious shopping centers, delivered through a partnership with Cadillac Fairview, the commercial real estate arm of the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. On paper, it was the safest possible entry. Established landlord, marquee locations, decades of brand trust already spilling across the border from American cross shoppers. What it didn't fully account for was that a market 1/10 the size of the United States, with different income distribution, different shipping economics, and a population spread across enormous distances, might simply not generate enough high-spending customers to fill 5 separate shoe departments in every city Nordstrom chose to enter. The second decision, arguably the more consequential one, was to keep expanding after the losses had already become an established pattern. Nordstrom Rack didn't open its first Canadian location until 2018, 4 years after Nordstrom itself had entered the market and 4 years into an unbroken losing streak. The off-price chain kept adding Canadian stores through 2020, including a location in Langley, British Columbia, that opened just months before the pandemic reached North America. Retail analysts who later reviewed the company's internal sales data from 2019 found early evidence that the Canadian business was already struggling to meet its targets. A full year before COVID-19 gave the company an obvious external excuse to explain away weak performance. The warning signs, in other words, predated the pandemic. The pandemic simply made them impossible to ignore. There is no public evidence that Nordstrom's leadership was reckless or dishonest about any of this. Quite the opposite. The company's own later statements were unusually candid. When Nordstrom finally announced its exit in March 2023, Chief Executive Eric Nordstrom didn't hide behind vague corporate language. "We entered Canada in 2014 with a plan to build and sustain a long-term business there," he said. "Despite our best efforts, we do not see a realistic path to profitability for the Canadian business." That is not the language of a company looking for someone else to blame. It is the language of an executive acknowledging, plainly, that a strategic bet, made in good faith by people who genuinely believed in it, simply hadn't worked. What the frontline experience actually looked like in the years before that public admission was quieter and more human than any boardroom decision. Store associates in Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, and Vancouver kept fitting shoes, kept remembering customers' names, kept delivering the same service culture that had defined Nordstrom for over a century, without necessarily knowing that the division they worked for had never once turned a profit. Corporate visits from Seattle asking pointed questions about sales performance became part of the rhythm of the job. The kind of scrutiny employees learned to read as a sign that things aren't going the way head office had hoped, even when nobody says so directly. Retail industry observers later summarize what happened to the Canadian business not as a single catastrophic failure, but as, in the words of one Canadian retail analyst, death by 1,000 cuts, a slow accumulation of smaller pressures, none individually fatal that together proved impossible to outrun. Then came the compounding blows nobody could have planned for. The pandemic hit apparel retailers harder than almost any other category. Years later, Canadian apparel sales still hadn't fully recovered to pre-pandemic levels. Just as the health crisis eased, inflation arrived, squeezing consumer spending precisely among the middle-income shoppers Nordstrom needed to convert into loyal customers. Eric Nordstrom himself described the final holiday season before the closure as highly promotional, with sales softer than pre-pandemic levels even among the company's higher-income customers. By fiscal 2022, the numbers had become impossible to spin. Roughly $515 million in Canadian sales, and a $72 million loss on top of it. A single year's losses that on their own represented real money walking out the door with nothing coming back. The moment insiders finally accepted it was over came in early 2023 when Nordstrom's leadership made the decision to file for creditor protection under Canada's Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, rather than attempt another year of restructuring. It was, in its own way, an unusually orderly ending. The company established an employee trust to ensure Canadian workers received their full statutory entitlements to notice and severance, a step not every failing retailer bothers to take, and one that stood in visible contrast to messier collapses elsewhere in Canadian retail. Roughly 2,500 employees still lost their jobs, and there was a quiet irony sitting underneath the entire wind-down that few outside commercial real estate circles ever noticed. Cadillac Fairview, the very partner that had helped bring Nordstrom into the country in 2012 and delivered it into Canada's most prestigious malls, was now the landlord left holding empty anchor space in 5 of its own premier shopping centers, including the flagship Toronto Eaton Centre location that had once been treated as a crown jewel of the company's Canadian expansion. Nobody in Seattle had set out to fail in Canada. The decisions made along the way, the unmodified American playbook, the continued expansion through years of losses, the reliance on prestige real estate in a market that couldn't fully support it, were the kind of decisions that look reasonable individually and only become damning in hindsight once you can see the whole decade laid out end to end. By March 2023, that whole decade was finally laid out in a single blunt sentence from the company's own chief executive. And for the 2,500 employees about to receive their notice, and for the customers who had built years of quiet loyalty around a shoe fitting or a piano in the lobby, what came next would not be a slow fade. It would be an ending announced all at once and finished within 4 months. On the morning of March 2nd, 2023, employees at 13 Nordstrom and Nordstrom Rack locations across Canada came into work expecting an ordinary Thursday. By early afternoon, that expectation was gone. Nordstrom Inc. announced from its Seattle headquarters that it was winding down its entire Canadian operation. Every store, every job, every piece of the business it had spent 9 years building. The company had filed for protection from its creditors under the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, a Canadian insolvency process designed to manage an orderly shutdown rather than a chaotic one. For 2,500 employees, the announcement meant one thing above all else. The job they had that morning would not exist by the end of June. The speed of what followed still stands out, even against the backdrop of a decade that had already seen several major American retailers retreat from Canada. Less than 3 weeks after the announcement, on March 21st, 2023, Nordstrom received court approval to begin liquidation sales at every remaining location. 6 full-line Nordstrom stores and 7 Nordstrom Rack outlets, the entire physical footprint the company had spent from 2014 to 2020 assembling, one prestigious mall at a time, were now simply inventory to be cleared. The full-line stores had opened in careful sequence. Calgary's Chinook Centre in September 2014, Ottawa's Rideau Centre the following March, Vancouver's Pacific Centre that September, then 3 Toronto locations in quick succession, the Eaton Centre in Yorkdale in 2016, Sherway Gardens in 2017. Each opening had been treated at the time as evidence of momentum. Now all 6 were converging on the same final date, less than 4 months after the announcement that started the clock. For employees on the sales floor, the weeks in between were an unusual kind of limbo. Stores stayed open. Customers kept coming in, some out of loyalty, some simply curious to see what a department store looks like while it's dying. Associates who had spent years building relationships with regular customers, remembering their sizes, their preferences, the specific brands they always asked about, now had to have a different kind of conversation, explaining that the store itself had a closing date, even as they kept doing their jobs exactly as they always had. In Vancouver, where more than 600 Nordstrom employees worked across the city's stores, local news described staff as genuinely shocked by how quickly a company with such a long, stable reputation had decided to leave the country entirely. 9 years of employment, of training, of the kind of customer relationships the Nordstrom way had always been built on, were now compressed into a countdown measured in weeks. Nordstrom's own public language throughout this period stayed measured and unusually direct. Chief Executive Eric Nordstrom didn't frame the decision as anyone's fault. It was, in his own words, the acknowledgement of a plan that hadn't worked despite years of genuine effort. That candor didn't make the timeline any less abrupt for the people living through it. A company can announce a wind down with dignity and still leave 2,500 people with a countdown clock instead of a career. The liquidation sale itself became its own small chapter of public embarrassment. When the doors opened for discounted shopping on March 21st, customers expecting steep markdowns instead found price tags reduced by a modest 5%, a discount so small that shoppers at the Toronto Eaton Centre and Vancouver's Pacific Centre location openly mocked it on social media within hours. One retail consultant visiting the Eaton Centre store that first day described the mood as busy with browsers, but light on actual buyers. Customers wandering the racks, checking the discount, and moving on without purchasing. Luxury brands like Chanel and Gucci had already been pulled from the shelves entirely, shipped back to American stores rather than sold off at a discount, leaving Canadian shoppers to pick through private label goods and secondary brands instead of the marquee names that had drawn them to Nordstrom in the first place. A retail strategist called the opening discount insulting to customers who had shown up expecting a real liquidation event. The discounts deepened gradually over the following weeks, the way liquidation sales typically do. Emptier racks, steeper markdowns, fewer size options, until by the final days, deals reached as high as 80% off. The 7 Nordstrom Rack stores were the first to go dark completely, closing for good at the end of the day on Sunday, May 14, 2023, less than 5 years after Nordstrom Rack had first opened in Canada, with plans for as many as 15 locations. What was left behind by closing day was mostly bare racking and empty fixtures, the physical shell of a store with almost nothing inside it. The 6 full-line Nordstrom stores held on a few weeks longer, closing for the final time on Tuesday, June 13, 2023. There was no single dramatic image that came to define the last day. No crowds lined up the way they had been outside Chinook Center 9 years earlier. Instead, there were quieter scenes repeated across 6 cities: empty display cases, security staff standing where sales associates once worked the floor, the last handful of shoppers moving through racks that had been steadily thinning out for months. Nordstrom's own website simply confirmed the date as the company's last day of business in the country. Gift cards were honored through the end of the liquidation. After that, there was nothing left to redeem them against. National media covered the closure extensively, and much of the coverage settled on a particular framing that stuck. This wasn't a story about a company collapsing, the way Sears Canada or Target Canada had collapsed years earlier. Nordstrom Inc. remained financially healthy in the United States, and closing the Canadian division was expected to modestly improve the parent company's overall profitability once the losses stopped. What Canadian coverage focused on instead was the particular shape of this failure. A well-capitalized, century-old, genuinely respected retailer that had tried in good faith for 9 straight years and still hadn't found a way to make the numbers work. One prominent headline captured the tone many outlets settled on. Nordstrom had followed a familiar path, moving in with confidence and leaving without ever quite understanding the market it had entered. Behind the scenes, the exit left a visible hole in Canadian shopping centers that would take years to fill. Chinook Center lost its Nordstrom anchor entirely, leaving Cadillac Fairview, the same real estate partner that had helped bring the company into the country in 2012, to find new tenants for a space it had once considered a marquee addition to its portfolio. The Toronto Eaton Centre location, once treated as a flagship achievement of the Canadian expansion, sat vacant while mall owners across the country began reconsidering what a modern anchor tenant should even look like. For the 2,500 employees who had worn a Nordstrom name tag, June 13, 2023 was simply the day the paychecks stopped. For the malls left holding the empty square footage, it was the beginning of a much longer, quieter problem. And for a brand that had spent over a century building its name on the idea that good judgment and personal service could win over any customer, anywhere, it was proof that neither one, no matter how genuine, could fully compensate for a market that had never quite embraced the bet in the first place. When the last Nordstrom doors closed on June 13, 2023, the company left behind something more tangible than an empty balance sheet. It left roughly 1.5 million square feet of vacant retail space, scattered across 6 of the country's most prominent shopping centers. Space that, in total, had cost Nordstrom an estimated $775 million to build out over 9 years, all of it now sitting dark. Filling that space turned out to be harder than anyone expected. Commercial real estate analysts warned almost immediately that backfilling stores of this size, some spanning 3 full levels and over 200,000 square feet, would be both difficult and expensive, since so few retailers operate at a scale that could use that much room. For months, the biggest, most valuable boxes simply sat empty. Vancouver's Pacific Centre location, which had actually been Nordstrom's best-performing Canadian store, remained vacant well into the following year. In Calgary, Chinook Centre's 2-story former Nordstrom became a subject of local speculation and internet jokes, with residents proposing everything from a dollar store to, only half seriously, a robot fight club. Toronto's Eaton Centre location briefly became a temporary interactive exhibit space before Cadillac Fairview finally found a permanent answer. That answer, when it came in June 2024, was a distinctly Canadian one. La Maison Simon, a Quebec City-based department store with roots stretching back to 1840, a genuine homegrown competitor that had quietly outlasted Nordstrom, Target, and Sears Canada all at once, agreed to take over the former Nordstrom spaces at both the Eaton Centre and Yorkdale Shopping Centre, part of a $75 million investment expected to create about 400 new retail jobs. It was a fitting, if quiet, irony. The space a major American retailer had spent a decade trying and failing to make work was handed over to a Canadian retailer that had understood its own market for well over a century. Calgary's Chinook Centre, meanwhile, gradually filled its former Nordstrom footprint with a mix of tenants that told its own story about where retail was heading. Harry Rosen, Louis Vuitton, Apple, smaller footprint, higher margin specialty stores rather than another sprawling department store anchor. There was no meaningful attempt to revive the Nordstrom name in Canada. No relaunch, no licensing deal, no nostalgia pop-up. Unlike some failed retailers, whose brand names get sold off and resurrected years later under new ownership, Nordstrom Inc. simply closed the division, absorbed the loss, and redirected its full attention back to the American business it had never stopped running successfully. The company's own financial filings framed the decision plainly. Exiting Canada was expected to modestly improve overall profitability once the losses stopped. For Nordstrom as a whole, Canada had been a chapter, not a turning point. The broader industry lesson, though, extended well past Nordstrom itself. Nordstrom's exit came within weeks of another American retailer, Bed Bath & Beyond, announcing it would close all 65 of its own Canadian stores, the second major U.S. chain to abandon the country in a matter of months. Retail analysts and commercial real estate experts, watching the pattern repeat, pointed to a familiar shape. An American retailer arrives with a proven domestic playbook, assumes Canadian consumers will behave like American ones, underestimates how differently a smaller, more geographically scattered market actually functions, and eventually retreats, often years later, having never quite closed the gap between expectation and reality. Nordstrom joined a list that already included Target Canada's spectacular two-year collapse in 2015 and Sears Canada's slower decline through the 2010s. Each failure was different in its details. All of them shared the same underlying miscalculation, assuming that what worked reliably in the United States would simply transplant itself across the border, unchanged. For the communities built around these stores, the impact went beyond corporate strategy memos. Roughly 2,500 Canadian workers lost their jobs. Mall landlords, themselves largely owned by Canadian pension funds, including the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, which had helped bring Nordstrom into the country in the first place, absorbed years of lost rent and the cost of reimagining some of the country's largest retail spaces almost from scratch. And shoppers who had built genuine loyalty around a particular sales associate, a particular shoe department, a particular piano near a particular escalator, simply lost access to something they had only just begun to think of as permanent. What does it mean when a company with over a century of trust behind it, entering a market with every conceivable advantage, capital, brand recognition, an already loyal cross-border customer base, still can't make the numbers work after 9 years of genuine effort? Perhaps the honest answer is less about Nordstrom's specific mistakes and more about a harder truth facing every American retailer eyeing the country next door. Proximity is not the same as understanding, and a market that looks familiar from the outside can still refuse, quietly and for years, to behave the way you expected it to. Picture it one last time, a Saturday afternoon, sometime in the middle of the last decade, in one of 6 Canadian cities that briefly had the privilege of hosting it. A grand piano plays somewhere near the escalators, soft enough to notice, quiet enough not to interrupt a conversation. Down in the shoe department, an associate kneels to measure a child's foot properly, the way it's always been done, checking both feet even though almost no one ever asks. A woman tries on a coat she's been eyeing for weeks, and the person helping her remembers, without being told, that she prefers navy to black. Somewhere else in the store, a young man in an ill-fitting suit is getting it altered on the spot, free of charge because he has a job interview in the morning and someone behind the counter decided that mattered enough to fix today. None of it felt remarkable in the moment. That was the whole point. It simply felt like being taken care of. What made a place like this matter was never really the merchandise. Coats and shoes and cosmetics can be bought almost anywhere. What Nordstrom offered, for the brief span of years it operated in Canada, was something harder to purchase and easier to lose: the sense that a stranger behind a counter was genuinely on your side. That idea had a long history behind it. A Swedish immigrant who believed, over a century earlier, that service and selection would always matter more than speed or scale. An employee in Alaska who once handed over cash for a set of tires the store never sold, simply because it seemed like the right thing to do. A culture built deliberately around trusting ordinary people to make good decisions without needing permission first. When that culture crossed the border in 2014, it carried all of that history with it, even if most Canadian shoppers walking in for the first time had no way of knowing it. For 9 years in Calgary and Ottawa, in Toronto and Vancouver, that history played out in small, human moments that never made the news. A return accepted without an argument, a birthday remembered, a difficult morning made a little easier by someone who didn't have to help, but chose to anyway. It gave a handful of Canadian cities something they hadn't quite had in that particular form: a department store that treated the relationship as the product and the products themselves as almost secondary. It never became the institution it had been in the United States, not in the time it was given, but for the employees who built real careers there, and for the customers who found, even briefly, a store that seemed to know them. It meant something. It mattered while it lasted, the way good things are allowed to matter even when they don't last forever. It is worth remembering, honestly and without bitterness, that this was not a story of villainy. No one set out to fail. A company with more than a century of proof that its way of doing business worked simply ran into a country that, for reasons more complicated than any single decision, never quite met it halfway. The people who tried to make it work, the executives who believed in the plan, the associates who fitted shoes and altered suits and remembered names, the customers who gave a new store their trust, all of them deserve to be remembered plainly, without exaggeration and without cynicism. 2,500 people lost their jobs when the doors finally closed, and each of them carried something out of that building that no liquidation sale could put a price on. The knowledge of what it felt like to do the work well and to have it matter to someone. The piano no longer plays near those escalators. The shoe departments are gone, along with the racks and the fitting rooms and the quiet, practiced attentiveness that used to fill the space between them. Other stores have moved in, and life in those malls has gone on, the way it always does. But somewhere in Calgary and Toronto and Vancouver, someone still remembers exactly how it felt to be helped by a person who seemed to genuinely want to help. And they will describe it, if asked, the way people describe something they didn't know they'd miss until it was gone. That memory is a small thing in the end. It is also, perhaps, the only thing a company like this was ever really in the business of making. It is worth keeping.